General George S. Patton had seen the absolute worst of human destruction. He was a man forged in the brutal fires of the First World War, a hardened cavalryman who had watched men be torn apart by machine gun fire in the muddy trenches of France, and a commander who had just spent the last 3 years of his life leading armored columns through the explosive, blood-soaked battlefields of North Africa, Sicily, and Western Europe. He was known to the entire world as Old Blood and Guts, a brilliant but ruthless general who famously carried ivory-handled revolvers and believed that the highest honor a man could achieve was to die fighting for his country. Patton was not a man who was easily shocked. He had walked through shattered cities and burning forests without blinking. But nothing in his long, violent military career, nothing in all the textbooks of warfare, and nothing in his worst nightmares could have possibly prepared him for what he was about to witness in the spring of 1945. When the United States Third Army finally smashed its way into the heartland of Germany and pushed through the heavy wooden gates of a place called Ohrdruf, the legendary General Patton did something that no one had ever seen him do before. He broke down. The man who had once slapped a weeping American soldier for showing weakness, the man who demanded absolute, unbreakable toughness from everyone around him, was physically brought to his knees. The stench of the camp, the unimaginable cruelty of the SS guards, and the sheer scale of the mechanized murder forced the great General Patton to turn his back, lean against a wooden shed, and violently empty his stomach. But his sickness did not last long. Within minutes, that sickness turned into a cold, terrifying, and merciless rage. What Patton and his American combat troops did to the Nazi guards and the local German officials in the hours and days following the liberation of Ohrdruf remains one of the most powerful, chilling, and controversial moments of justice in all of human history. Before we dive deep into this incredibly raw and unfiltered true story of World War II, I need you to make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video if you believe that the real, uncensored history of the greatest generation must never be forgotten. We are going to explore some very dark and difficult truths today, and I want to know exactly where you stand. If you believe that monsters who commit crimes against humanity deserve absolutely zero mercy when they are finally caught, type the word justice in the comments right now. But if you believe that a civilized army must always follow the strict rules of the Geneva Convention, no matter how evil the enemy is, type the word rules. There is no easy answer here, so let us travel back to April of 1945 and step through the gates of a living hell. To truly understand the explosive, earth-shattering impact of the Ohrdruf concentration camp on the American military high command, you have to understand the mindset of the Allied soldiers as they crossed the border into Germany. For years, the American public and the regular combat troops had been hearing vague, shadowy rumors about terrible camps hidden deep within the dark forests of the Third Reich. According to the historical archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the deeply researched memoirs of the soldiers who fought in the European theater, many American troops initially believed that these rumors were just exaggerated wartime propaganda. They thought it was just the government trying to fire them up to fight the Germans. They expected to find tough prisoner of war camps, perhaps brutal work details, but they expected to find something that still fell within the boundaries of a recognizable human war. They had no idea that they were about to uncover an entire industrial empire dedicated completely to the torture and extermination of human beings. The SS, the elite, fanatical paramilitary organization that ran these camps, had spent over a decade marinating in a toxic, deeply dangerous ideology of racial superiority. According to the brilliant historical analysis by Ladislas Farago in his book Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, these SS guards did not see themselves as regular soldiers. They genuinely believed, down to their very bones, that they were a biologically superior master race, and that the people they were guarding were nothing more than insects to be crushed. For years, these guards had operated with absolute, unquestioned authority, living in comfortable homes near the camps, eating warm food, and listening to classical music. While just a few hundred yards away, they starved, beat, and murdered innocent men, women, and children with a terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. They thought they would never be held accountable. They thought they would win the war, and the ashes of their victims would just blow away in the wind. If you find it terrifying how easily ordinary human beings can be brainwashed into becoming absolute monsters when given total power over others, type the word truth in the comments right now, because this psychological reality is something we must always guard against. Everything changed on the morning of April 4th, 1940. The battle-hardened veterans of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division, serving under Patton's Third Army, were pushing rapidly through the German state of Thuringia. As they approached the small, seemingly quiet town of Ohrdruf, the soldiers began to notice something strange. According to the incredibly detailed combat reports filed by the commanding officers, the first thing the American troops noticed was not a visual sight, but a smell. It was a thick, sweet, sickening odor that hung heavy in the cold spring air, clinging to the uniforms of the soldiers and burning the back of their throats. As the tanks rolled closer to the fenced enclosure just outside the town, the silence was deafening. There was no gunfire. There was no resistance. The American GIs, boys from farms in Ohio and city streets in New York, who had fought their way across the beaches of Normandy and survived the freezing hell of the Battle of the Bulge, finally pushed their way through the main gates of the Ohrdruf camp. The sight that greeted them was something that would haunt their nightmares until the day they died. According to the official military testimonies recorded by the United States Army Center of Military History, the entire compound was littered with the unburied corpses of prisoners. They were stacked like cordwood in the mud. The few survivors who slowly emerged from the wooden barracks did not even look human anymore. They were walking skeletons, their eyes completely hollow, too weak to even cheer for their liberators. The SS guards, realizing that the American army was closing in, had tried to execute as many prisoners as possible before fleeing into the woods, but they had run out of time. The American soldiers, tough, battle-scarred infantrymen who had seen their own best friends blown to pieces in combat, dropped their rifles and wept openly. Some of them fell to their knees and vomited in the dirt. But that initial shock, that crushing wave of grief, very quickly mutated into a blinding, uncontrollable rage. I want you to put yourself in the boots of an American soldier in that exact moment. You have just fought your way across an ocean. You have lost your brothers in arms, and now you are standing in a camp full of murdered, innocent people. If you think you would be able to hold back your anger and arrest the remaining guards peacefully, type the word peace. But if you know deep in your heart that you would want immediate, violent revenge, type the word revenge in the comments right now. I read every single comment and I want to know your honest reaction. The regular enlisted soldiers were deeply traumatized, but the defining moment of the Ohrdruf liberation came 8 days later, on April 12, 1945. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, along with General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton, arrived at the camp to see the horrors for themselves. This was an unprecedented gathering of military power. The three most important men in the entire European war effort were walking together through the muddy, blood-soaked grounds of a concentration camp. According to General Omar Bradley's own personal memoir, A Soldier's Story, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Eisenhower, a man who usually commanded armies from a desk in a clean headquarters, forced himself to walk into the deepest, darkest corners of the camp. He inspected the torture rooms. He walked right up to the piles of decaying bodies. Bradley noted that Eisenhower's face turned completely pale, almost gray, and his jaw was locked so tight it looked like it might shatter. Eisenhower knew that he had to see every single terrible detail, because he knew that humanity would eventually try to forget it. But the most shocking reaction came from General Patton. Patton, the ultimate warrior, the man who had always romanticized the glory and the bloodshed of combat, was completely physically overwhelmed by the sheer, cowardly evil of what he was looking at. According to multiple eyewitness accounts from the officers present, Patton walked into a shed where the bodies of the starved prisoners had been carelessly tossed, took one look, turned his face to the wooden wall, and violently threw up. The stench and the horror had broken through his heavy armor of military toughness. When he finally composed himself, his face was red, and his eyes were burning with a hatred that no German army had ever provoked in him. Patton turned to Eisenhower and Bradley and said, in a voice trembling with pure rage, that they had to make the German people see this. He realized in that brilliant, calculating military mind of his that this was not just a military victory. This was a psychological war, and the Nazi mythology of the master race had to be completely and permanently destroyed in the minds of the everyday German citizens who lived right down the road. If you respect the fact that these legendary generals did not look away, but forced themselves to witness the absolute worst of human nature, type the word respect in the comments to honor their courage. While the generals were formulating their strategic response, the American combat troops on the ground were dealing out their own brand of immediate, brutal justice. The historical records of what the regular GIs did to the SS guards who were foolish enough to be caught in or near the Ohrdruf camp are incredibly complex, deeply controversial, and often carefully sanitized in our modern history books. But we are here to tell the unvarnished truth. According to numerous historical accounts and oral histories provided by the veterans of the Third Army, when the American soldiers found the guards who had tortured and executed these starving prisoners, the strict rules of the Geneva Convention completely vanished into the smoke of the burning camp. The GIs did not see these SS men as enemy combatants who were entitled to the rights of a prisoner of war. They saw them as rabid animals. In many documented instances, when the American troops rounded up the remaining guards, they did not politely march them away to a holding pen. Instead, they forced the clean, well-fed, arrogant SS officers to walk through the piles of the dead. They forced them to look into the hollow faces of the survivors they had tormented. And in a terrifying display of raw, unfiltered retribution, the American soldiers often simply handed their own heavy M1 Garand rifles, or their heavy wooden batons, over to the liberated camp inmates, and then the Americans purposefully turned their backs and walked away. The sound of gunshots, the sound of heavy screaming, and the brutal noise of physical beatings echoed through the camp for days as the starving victims finally tore their former tormentors to pieces. And the American soldiers, men who had been raised in civilized, law-abiding towns back in the United States, stood by and let it happen, smoking their cigarettes and shedding no tears for the dying Nazis. Was this a war crime, or was this the purest form of natural justice the world has ever seen? This is a question that historians have debated for almost 80 years. If you believe that the American soldiers were completely justified in looking the other way while the inmates took their revenge, type the word justified in the comments right now. But if you believe that we must never sink to the level of our enemies, and that even the worst monsters deserve a fair trial in a court of law, type the word trial. Be honest with your feelings, because these are the heavy moral burdens that our grandfathers had to carry home with them. But General George S. Patton was not satisfied with just punishing the guards. He understood that the massive mechanized machinery of the Holocaust could not have existed without the silent complicity, the willful ignorance, and the quiet cooperation of the average, everyday German citizens who lived in the beautiful, clean towns right outside the gates of these camps. Ohrdruf was located just a short distance from the picturesque town of Gotha. The citizens of Gotha claimed, as almost all German citizens claimed when the Americans arrived, that they had absolutely no idea what was happening inside the camp. They claimed they never smelled the burning flesh. They never saw the trains full of starving people. and they were innocent victims of Hitler's regime. Patton knew this was an absolute cowardly lie. According to the deeply moving historical accounts preserved by the National Archives, Patton flew into a legendary rage when he heard these excuses. He immediately issued a terrifying military order. He commanded his military police to march down to the town of Gotha and drag the local mayor, a man who had comfortably overseen the town while thousands died on his doorstep, along with his wife and several prominent citizens, up the hill to the Ohrdruf concentration camp. Patton was going to force the civilian population to rub their noses in the bloody mess they had allowed to happen. The military police, acting with zero patience and zero politeness, forced the mayor, dressed in his fine civilian clothes, to walk through the thick, bloody mud of the camp. They forced the mayor and his wife to stand over the rotting, emaciated corpses of the prisoners. They forced them to smell the stench of death that they had claimed to never notice. The American officers yelled at them, demanding to know how they could possibly claim ignorance when the ashes of these innocent people had been falling on their clean German houses. The psychological impact of this forced tour was devastatingly effective, and the outcome was something no one entirely predicted. That very night, after returning to their comfortable home in the town of Gotha, the mayor and his wife, completely broken by the overwhelming guilt, the sheer horror of what they had been forced to witness, and the crushing realization that the entire world now knew the truth of their society, took their own lives. They hung themselves in their home. When General Patton was informed of the mayor's suicide the next morning, he reportedly showed absolutely no sympathy. To Patton, and to the battle-hardened American troops, it was simply the overdue confession of a guilty conscience. If you believe that Patton was absolutely right to force the townspeople to look at the horrors they ignored, type the word "right" in the comments. Let us see how many of you stand with General Patton's legendary method of psychological warfare. The liberation of Ohrdruf changed the entire trajectory of the Allied psychological strategy for the remainder of the war in Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, recognizing the profound, dark importance of what they had discovered, immediately issued a series of sweeping orders that would echo through history. According to the official communications preserved by the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Eisenhower sent urgent, high-priority messages back to Washington and London. He demanded that politicians, members of Congress, and international journalists be flown across the Atlantic immediately to witness the camps with their own eyes. Eisenhower knew human nature. He knew that as time passed, as the shock faded, people would try to deny that these crimes had ever taken place. He famously stated that he wanted everything photographed, everything documented, and everything recorded, so that in his own words, the path of history would not be distorted, and that no one could ever dismiss this as wartime propaganda. He forced every single American soldier in the area who was not actively engaged in combat to walk through the camp. Eisenhower wanted his men to know exactly why they had been fighting this long, terrible war, and exactly what kind of absolute evil they were wiping off the face of the earth. Because of Eisenhower's brilliant foresight and Patton's aggressive enforcement of making the Germans face their own crimes, we now have the undeniable photographic proof of the Holocaust. We have the footage of the bulldozers pushing the bodies, the footage of the weeping survivors, and the footage of the shocked, horrified American farm boys standing in the gates of hell. If you are grateful for General Eisenhower's wisdom in documenting these atrocities, so that history can never be rewritten or denied by those who wish to hide the truth, type the word "never forget" in the comments right now. Your engagement helps push this true history out to a younger generation that desperately needs to hear it. As we look back on the actions of General George S. Patton, the decisions of General Eisenhower, and the raw, violent retribution carried out by the everyday American GIs at the gates of Ohrdruf, we are forced to confront the most difficult and uncomfortable realities of human conflict. The story of Ohrdruf is not a sanitized, clean Hollywood movie where the heroes ride in on white horses and everything is neatly resolved. It is a messy, brutal, and deeply traumatizing chapter of our history. It shows us that war fundamentally alters the human soul. The American soldiers who arrived in Europe as innocent young men were transformed into hard, unforgiving judges who handed down swift and violent sentences to the SS guards who had abandoned their own humanity. We can sit in the comfort of the modern world and debate the legality of what the American troops did to those guards. We can debate whether Patton's psychological torment of the German mayor was unnecessarily cruel. But unless we have stood in that freezing mud, unless we have smelled the overwhelming stench of an industrial slaughterhouse, and unless we have looked into the hollow, dying eyes of a fellow human being who has been treated worse than an animal, we can never truly judge the actions of the men who liberated those camps. They did what they felt they had to do in the presence of pure, unadulterated evil. They broke the mythology of the Nazi master race, not just with tanks and artillery, but by dragging the arrogant architects of that system down into the mud and forcing them to face the terrifying consequences of their arrogance. The educational value of this heavy, difficult story is immense. It teaches us that civilization is incredibly fragile. It teaches us that everyday people can easily become complicit in the most horrific crimes if they choose to look the other way, just like the citizens of Gotha. And most importantly, it teaches us that there are moments in history where evil must be met with absolute, uncompromising strength. As we close this deep dive into the darkest corners of World War II, I want to leave you with one final thought, and I want to hear your voice in the comments. Do you believe that the modern world has learned the lessons of Ohrdruf? Or do you think we are still capable of looking the other way while atrocities happen? Let me know your thoughts. And if this video challenged you, if it taught you something new, and if you believe in preserving the raw, uncensored history of our past, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications so you never miss a deep dive. Thank you for standing with the history. Thank you for honoring the memory of those who suffered, and I will see you in the next episode.